Okay, we're going to look at classifying governments, the different types of government. The first way we're going to classify is the number who can participate, and we're going to look in depth at democracy and dictatorships. Second classification we're going to look at is the geographic distribution of power, and then the relationship between the legislative and the executive branch. Under the number who can participate, this is our first classification. The first thing we're going to look at is the democracy. And I have here a quote from Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address: of the people, by the people, for the people. And that's what a democracy is. We're looking at the maximum number of people in terms of the number who can participate. Everyone should be able to participate in a government, in a democracy. And we've got two different types of democracy. The first one is an indirect or a representative democracy. This is where you have elections. This is where we have government with the consent of the governed. That just means the governed are the people who are being represented. They are the ones who elect people, send them off to wherever, and those individuals will make the laws and enforce the laws from everyone else, or for everyone else. Another term we use for this is a republic. So this is the one that you should associate with the United States. So make sure that you're getting this in your notes. The United States is an indirect democracy. More specifically, we are a constitutional democratic republic. And we democratically, or everyone gets to vote on the individuals who are going to represent us. And then those representatives go off and they make the laws and they enforce the laws. So we are, by definition, a constitutional democratic republic. We are an indirect democracy. We don't vote on the issues. We elect people to do that. In a direct democracy, that would actually be where individuals, everyone in society, would get to go in and vote on the particular public policy issues themselves instead of electing someone to do that for us. These only work in small communities. There is no way with 350 million people in the United States that every time a public policy issue needed to be discussed, debated, or even voted on, that we could possibly do that. Once again, very small communities. And these terms here are usually used interchangeably, although their definitions are slightly different. You will hear the United States called a democracy. You'll hear us called a republic or a representative democracy, or that we have a republican form of government. So although they are slightly different, for the most part, they basically mean the same thing in our society. Second, under number who can participate, we just looked at, the largest number in terms of democracy where everyone can, to a dictatorship. And a dictatorship is the oldest and most common form. And this is basically where a small group of people or one person participates in the lawmaking and in the enforcing of laws. You have autocratic dictators, and this is where there's one person. Adolf Hitler was an autocratic dictator. If you did not do what Adolf Hitler wanted, he made the rules, he made the laws, enforced the laws, interpreted the laws. He was the government. He was authoritarian, which meant it didn't matter what you wanted as an individual. He had the authority to make all the laws. And totalitarian means he had the authority to make over all the laws over every aspect of your life. He had total control or total authority over everything. An oligarchy is where you have a small group of people. Typically they are self-appointed, usually military, and that's how these people keep their power. You have the military involved in this. And a junta is just a small group of military officers, usually who have control over a particular government. Kim Jong-un is the dictator of North Korea and recently took power after his father's death. This is Muammar Gaddafi, who took over Libya in 1969, and it's just been within the last year or so that he lost power in Libya because of a civil war, and the opposition actually found him and killed him. And that's an important thing to remember, is a lot of times when you have these dictatorships or these transfers of power, they are very bloody, which is very different from what we have here, and we'll talk about that specifically later. And then this is Joseph Stalin, who was the dictator of the former Soviet Union, which no longer exists. Moving on to the second classification, we just looked at the number who can participate. Now we're going to look at in terms of where geographically does the power lie. Not how much power, but where is it in your government or in your state, in your country. First one we're going to look at is a unitary form of government. This is also known as a centralized government. Local governments are created out of convenience. This unitary form is the most common, and Great Britain is the example of this. There is one single central organization, and that's Parliament, and they hold all the governmental powers. That does not mean that their government is all powerful. What it means is, because of the size of Great Britain, and we'll look at that here in a second. Well, actually, we'll just go ahead and put it up there. Look at the size of Great Britain. The United States, very large compared to Great Britain. Great Britain's not even as large as the state of Texas. They don't need layers and layers of government just because of their size. So they only need one small, centrally located government, and then they do have local governments, but most of their power comes from Parliament. Parliament can take it away, and it's just to relieve some of the burdens off of Parliament. So that's unitary. The second one we're going to look at, federal, and this is the one you need to associate with the United States. This is where you have power divided between the central government and local governments. And what divides these two into the powers that they have is some superior authority that's over both of them. And here in the United States, make sure you get this in your notes, the superior authority over both of these governments, our central and local, is our Constitution. The Constitution divides the power, and it also says that neither one of them, the central government or our state governments, can change the rules acting alone. They have to do so together. So in the United States, our national government, our federal government, our central government, make sure you write down those all mean the same. National, federal, central, interchangeable, mean exactly the same. Has certain powers, and then the 50 states have their own powers. And I put unitary form here because if we were just to pull out the state of Indiana and look at its government, it is a unitary form. Where is it located? Indianapolis, centrally located. Yes, each community has its own local governments, but those were created by Indianapolis, by the General Assembly, and those powers can be taken away. That takes some of the pressure, and it takes some of the responsibilities off of that central government, but we don't need layer upon layer just in the state of Indiana. So when we're looking at the United States as a whole, we are a federal government. If we pull the individual 50 states out, the 50 states have a unitary form of government. And once again, the Constitution sets up for this division of power, state powers. Make sure that you understand, in a federal system of government, the states are not sovereign. That is critical when we look at the next form under geographic distribution, and that is a confederacy. A confederacy is an alliance of independent states. In the United States, the 50 states are not independent, but in our history, there was a time when the states were sovereign countries. Under the Articles of Confederation from 1781 to 1789, 1781 is when the Revolutionary War ends, 1789 is where the new Constitution takes effect, and then also during the Civil War, when the southern states split from the Union, the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865, they were a confederacy. So those states that were part of that Union in the South were actually independent sovereign countries. So make sure that you understand that and get that in your notes. In a confederacy, the central government has very, very limited powers. Typically, they allow them to have some sort of defense and foreign affairs policies to act for the whole entire Union, but they do not have the power to make laws that directly apply to individuals of those particular states because the states are still sovereign. So a confederacy makes it possible for states to cooperate while they maintain their sovereignty. European Union is the example that we'll look at that's closest to what a confederacy would be. Originally, 12 countries formed it in 1993 to deal with free trade. If you have ever looked at a map of Europe, you have a lot of very small countries. and each one of them at one point in time had their own currency. So in a day's time, you could literally travel to several different countries, and every time you entered one, you'd have to get their form of money. That's what currency is. So now what you have are 27 member countries that are part of the European Union, and they formed a common currency to make trade much easier. And so if you are a part of that, you actually use the euro. The third classification we're going to look at is the relationship between a legislative and executive. Please get in your notes. The legislature or a legislative branch is the one that makes the laws. The executive branch is responsible for enforcing laws. And so you can classify it two different ways. And the first way, looking at the relationship between these two branches, is the presidential form. And that's what we have, and we actually were the first one, and we invented that. When we look at our lawmaking body, which we call Congress, and we look at our executive, which is our president, these branches are independent of each other, and they are co-equal to each other. And so what happens is we have elections where the people choose the executive. That's the difference basically between this and Parliament. We, the people, choose the executive. Independently of our legislative branch, the people get to elect the legislative branch, but they don't have any say in who the executive is. Our executive holds office for a fixed term. Here in the United States, it's 4 years. And this is outlined in the Constitution. Our Constitution sets up how we elect representatives, and how the people elect the executive, and it sets up the term of office, and then it also sets up a system of checks and balances, and so that we separate what they do, but within each one of them we put a check on them so that the president can't do what he wants to without sometimes the legislative branch being able to overrule what he does. And then there are times where the legislative branch tries to do something and the president can overrule that. And we'll talk specifically about that, but make sure you understand the Constitution sets up this separation of powers, and then it also gives a checking system on the two, and what that does is balance the power so that one of them does not get more powerful than the other. This is the seal for the President of the United States, and once again, the people, not the legislative branch, elects the President. And this is a picture of the House of Representatives, and that's part of Congress. And the second one is the parliamentary form. A majority of governments in the world are parliamentary. And when we look at the person who leads these governments, their title is either prime minister or premier, and then they have a cabinet. And in these governments, that's what their government is called. The prime minister and the cabinet make up the government. The difference here, the people do not elect the prime minister. Make sure you understand this. The legislative branch picks them, and it's one of their members. So the people elect the legislative branch, and then the legislative branch gets to pick from amongst themselves who they want to be their prime minister. And it is the leader of the majority party, because when you have an election, the majority is how you figure out who wins. So the person who the majority party picks gets to be the prime minister. Once again, they pick from among their own body, from that own legislative branch. If you have a multi-party system where you have lots and lots of political parties that are in your legislature, you may not be able to get a majority. You may not have one party that holds 51%. And so then what they do is form what are called coalitions, where multiple parties come together and try and form a coalition, which eventually will give you the majority number that you need to elect someone. They only remain in office, and I'm talking about the prime minister or premier and the cabinet, as long as their policies have the support of the majority party. The majority party picked them, and so as long as they get a vote of confidence and are doing what they're supposed to do, they can keep their jobs. But they can get what's called a vote of no confidence. If the majority does not like what they're doing, they can give a vote of no confidence. Then the government, which is the prime minister and the cabinet, must resign from that office, and then Parliament will call for new elections. But they may call for not only new elections of the prime minister and the cabinet, they can also call for a whole entire new election of everyone in Parliament. So make sure you understand that.